So the first speaker I want to introduce to the stage is Mirjam Westen. She's the senior curator of contemporary art at Museum Arnhem, also a critic and editor in the field of contemporary art, gender and global art. And she's going to talk about identity and representation, and she's making a passionate plea for the canon. Welcome to the stage, Mirjam Westen.
I feel very honored to be here and to have been invited to give a brief talk. And the title of my talk is Troubling Canons. An S is missing, sorry. And I stole this expression from two queer artists, Pauline O'Grody and Renate Lawrence. And they are working together as a duo, queering the art world, queering canons, and not wanting to be called queer. They want to disrupt canons. And their disruption or interruption of canons, I think, is very inspiring. But as you will see in the end, or at the end of my talk, I will give a pleidooi in Dutch, to canonize instead of what's usually being put forward in the whole discussion about decolonization. And then usually it's followed up by decanonization. I really think canon is important, but not just the canons as we know, but a different canon. So let me see how this works. And I actually wanted to say that I look very much forward to see your presentation in Venice, Iris and Remy. Inspired by feminism and the Black Power and civil rights movements, museums in the United States in the 60s and in Europe from the 70s actually, were attacked for their underrepresentation in their own institutions of the work of female and Black artists. An art world that thought of itself as neutral and independent, and that congratulated itself on its openness to innovation and experimentation, turned out to be anything but these things. Not only did museums reflect the inequalities in society in large, they actually underpin existing power structures and gender and racial dividing lines. Museums retained their role as generators of culture, but they were actually now seen in addition as generators of gender and racial differences. The hierarchies and the authority of established institutions were questioned. Art institutions hardly took notice of the work of female and Black artists. As Nancy Spiro wrote in the 70s, they all buttress one another in aesthetic policies and the business activity of the art market. And they all buttress one another in their insistence upon white male priority. Dissatisfaction over being excluded from exhibitions, from public collections, from subsidies and art publications. Oh, sorry, I did it a bit too quick. Have led to many forms of protest, ranging from the first protest marches against New York museums at the end of the 60s to both one woman and collective protest actions up till today. In 1968, for example, Faith Ringgold, an artist, took part in the protest march of the Black Emergence Cultural Coalition protesting against the exclusion of African American artists from the exhibition titled The 1930s, Painting and Sculpture in America, held by the Whitney Museum of American Art. In 1971, Ringgold co-founded the organization Where We At, Black Women Artists. Another organization standing up for the rights of women artists was Women Artists in Revolutions. From its foundation in 1969, white and black artists protested on the steps of museums, issuing fake press releases and writing pamphlets requesting all art institutions to openly take a stand against racism, sexism, oppression, and war. I also took some examples of her work from the 60s, such as from the series, the American People series that she started in 1963, and in which we could say she reflects on the very tense and very, racial relations and violence in the United States in the 60s. This painting actually was, although it is from 1967, it was actually only recently added to the collection of the MoMA through a gift. The next painting of Faith Ringgold shows the shift in her work, actually, from, the emphasis on the civil rights movement to the Black is Beautiful movements. In the Netherlands, in the 80s, this criticism of art institutions, of leaving out women artists, leaving out black artists, resulted in many policies, many cultural policies that emphasized cultural diversity. But despite these state cultural policies, such as stimulating awareness of international identity or stressing the solidarity in a multicultural society, and despite slogans as cultural participation, especially for young people and immigrants, up till now, 40 years later, many people of color share their discontent with what they don't see in museums. Last week in national newspaper, the Volkskrant writer Harriet Duurvoort criticized museums for their lax response to represent a changing population. Dutch writer and storyteller Neske Becks, who published in Dutch magazine Museumvisie, told or shared her vision, saying, "Watching an image of a white person doesn't prevent me from a sort..." Doesn't prevent me from a sort of recognition. The skin color of the milkmaid of Johannes Vermeer doesn't prohibit me to identify with her concentrated manner pouring milk. So why wouldn't the other way around be possible? In the field of art and literature, there exist many different opinions about the need to identify with the work of art. Some resist the whole idea of connecting art with ethnicity, class, or sexual preferences, arguing that art and literature should transcend all these kind of labels. Others, such as Professor Anne Phillips, an economist, finds identity politics, for example, very important because they have shown to break down the hegemony of nation, gender, race, and class. In her words, it provided a language for those who defined themselves according to identities such as gender, race, sexuality, ethnicity, and made it possible for them to articulate new equality claims. But of course, identity is not a fixed status, as we all have learned from Stuart Hall, who noticed already in the 1990s, saying how important it is that the sociologist Stuart Hall I'm referring to, how important it is to acknowledge that individuals have more than one identity. And I quote, "They have one that is based on similarities and a unity which comes from belonging to a shared culture, and one that is based on an active process of identification that responds to points of differences and is therefore always evolving through a continuous play of history, culture, and power." So an identity is not fixed, we still have the question, why is it important to identify? Why is it important to be represented? Many artists feel straitjacket when it comes to being, say, called, for example, a black artist. As Remy Jungerman mentioned in the last interview in Metropolis M recently, put it bluntly, I don't want to be straitjacket as a black artist. Artist Stanley Brown never ever wanted people to know his background, never wanted his work to be associated with some sort of identity. Queer and black Dutch writer Stefan Sanders described this as a paradox, and I quote him, "Forget that I am different, but never forget that I am different." So this dilemma, I think, is very important also for me in my practice as a curator, which I have been doing for more than 25 years. Culture and identity are very important words in political discourses. But on the one hand, we see that identity politics are put forward by feminist movement, left movements, but on the other hand also by nationalists and on the right-wing movements. I am sorry. Yeah, this was the picture I wanted to show to you. Just to show how artist Jimmy Durham had mocked this whole idea of identity. At the Art Basel Fair in 2011, I saw this installation and I really had to laugh about it. And he mocked this so-called national identity, in this case, national identity of a museum of Switzerland. And what had he put together? He had put together a lot of masks. They were exaggerated by a grotesque mix of noses, forehead wrinkles, and masks with red tombstones for teeth. He had put also together, next to these folk traditions, the famous knives, the Red Cross knives, etc. And of course, it was not accidental that in the same year that he put forward this installation, Maquette of Switzerland, in Switzerland itself, the minaret towers of mosques were forbidden. All new mosques are not allowed to build any minaret towers anymore. So let's get back to the Netherlands, where the Association of Dutch Museums took a really very long time to accept and then implement the terms of the so-called Code Cultural Diversity and its 4 Ps. I guess you all know of them: program, public, personal, and partners. And some people would like to add a 5th P to this code, namely problematic. When it comes to program and when it comes to public, for example, we all know that as soon there are shows with a lot of black artists, in this case, the Suriname show at the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, one can see immediately what the effect is on its visitors. This is a show which was held in 1996, after it was first held in Suriname. And one can ask, of course, why is identification so important? With what do we as visitors identify or would like to identify? I can tell you, when I was a student and in my first year of art history, I studied at Groningen, I went with Professor Henk van Os to Venice and to Siena. It was the good old days of art history students where these excursions were kind of for free. Very luxurious when I look back at it. And after 3 weeks, we ended up in Siena, and Henk van Os mentioned the artist and showed us the wall paintings by Simone Martini. And for the first time in these 3 weeks excursion, I was really happy. I thought, for heavens, finally a woman artist mentioned from the Middle Ages. And then it turned out Simone was not a woman artist, but a male artist, because Simone in Italy is also the name for a man. So you can imagine I was a bit disappointed. Why is identification important? Is it, say, that we want to identify with what we see in the image? But what happens when, for example, it's a totally abstract image? Do we then identify with knowing the artist, for example, Stanley Brown? Or do we have to know about the background of the works of this artist? This is another large project of American artist Lorraine O'Grady, who put in her work very much emphasis on refiguring art world through these framed artworks, photographs. So Stanley Brown, that we know only of his drawings, his measurements, and we have to know about his art to recognize it and maybe to identify with the background of the artist. But what if artists don't want to know their backgrounds to be spoken about and don't want their backgrounds to be known? That is, of course, it can be a problem, but for me as a curator, it has never been a problem. I just show them. I have another example for the Berlin Biennial. There's some problem with the, yeah, okay, now it's okay. Mitchell, there is a problem with the cable, I think, but it's okay now, but sometimes it falls away. I just have this image of Remy Jungerman's work, which is one could say an abstract work. Remy Jungerman does not want to be called either a black artist, as I understood from this interview. And I recognized at the last Berlin Biennial that had for the first time in its history a whole black team, how they somehow had a big play with identification in their exhibition. Because I don't know whether one of you has visited this last Berlin Biennial, they did not want to mention the background of the artist. They did not want to mention the date of birth. They did not want to mention where they were born. And that made you really look onto the works. Fortunately, it was mentioned in the catalog. But they wanted you really to play and to think about the background of these artists, especially because they did not want to mention it in the captions. And funny enough, this whole Berlin Biennale was being viewed as an important biennial because the theme was whole black, that I did not read in any review that at least 80% of the artists that were chosen were women artists, which had not happened before either at the Berlin Biennial. So there have been many actions to tell institutions, to warn institutions, to criticize institutions for their policies and to take their own history serious, as is shown with many letters or some letters that have been written in the Netherlands, for example, to Witte de Wit, who failed to come to terms with its own contradictions, or to the Rijksmuseum, in 2017. Also is important, I mentioned the policies of the 80s stressing cultural diversity, that it's not enough cultural diversity. And as Simone Sevag righteously says, it's very important not to emphasize only cultural diversity, but to talk about inclusivity. And that is that you have to really understand how class, race, gender is intersecting with each other. And we call that intersectionality. So in the 21st century, we could say we have moved beyond thinking in terms of ethnicity to more sophisticated approaches. Yes, I look at my watch and I feel so sorry that I'm the first one today, because I'm usually the one who takes a bit longer than is promised to me. But I try to hurry up, sorry. 5 minutes? Oh my God. So I'll skip a bit then. So when it comes to programs, the question of the canon emerges. Within the feminist art movement and the Black art movement, from the beginning, there was a plea for representation of women artists and Black artists in exhibitions and collections. And usually, this criticism was accompanied by a critical view on the canon. Questions were asked like, why become a part of a system that is rotten? So in the whole discussion of decolonization, also the discussion on decanonization emerged. And one could say decolonization is a method to understand or to analyze existing canons, but especially to destabilize existing canons. And this decolonization can work out as a de-erasure, like Bonaventure, the new curator of the Sandsbeek exhibition, emphasizes. But in my opinion, it's very important not only to question the canon and just to get rid of it, but actually keep or stick to a certain type of canon that is being rewritten. And that is because I think it's very important to have a shared body of knowledge, a shared body of work that can, throughout history, be shared so people can take notice of it. And I'm not talking about the canon as a fixed canon. I'm seeing, just as identity is not a fixed status, I would like to see canon as a thing in flux, as a canon in flux that can enlarge and grow with times and context. And to conclude with some examples of museums who did a really, this is a bit an outline of what I did when I noticed myself that I had to decolonize as a curator in the museum. This happened in the 90s when, while I was attending a lot of discussions on decolonization at the beginning of the 90s, amongst others organized by Riella Vrijsen, who is not with us anymore, unfortunately. I noticed myself that in exhibitions, I had not put in any artist with a different cultural backgrounds. So at that moment, I decided to put forward to myself at least a question every year in every exhibition for the whole year, these artists should be represented. So I had solo exhibitions of Angel Etundia Samba, of Carol Walker, 2001, and in group shows, I made sure that there were lots of artists that had a different cultural background and were very critical about the art world and canonization. It's a solo show by Esri Ariane Essi, 2014. And I would like to conclude with what the Baltimore Museum has done last year. It sold 7 artworks by Warhol, Klein, Rauschenberg, say the big names in the big canons, they sold only 7 works through an auction, and they bought 43 works of female artists and black artists, and artists from other continents as well, but especially Afro-American artists. Just to give, ja, nu valt hij weer weg. Because I wanted to show you what kind of artworks they had bought with this huge amount of money by selling these artworks. Of course, in the press, there was a lot of criticism. How can a museum skip its history by just selling artworks that made part of this history? And then the curators and the director, Mr. Bedford, said, they doubled in the collection. We have better works that represent these artists. That's why we are selling Warhols, Rauschenberg, and Franz Klein. So this is a work by Amy Sherald. This is also the artist who did a commission for Michelle Obama. You might remember her name. Another work is by famous Jack Whitten. His work is being sold for $12 million, just to give an impression, at the MoMA last year. This is, by the way, a work in which he reflects on the 9/11 attack in New York. And last but not least, a work by Isaac Julien. But as I said, 43 works of art were bought to enlarge the collection of the museum, but especially to diversify their collection and to make it possible that more people of Baltimore and others from around could identify with these artworks. So I would like to conclude with why I think it's so important to that this canon is being enlarged and criticized at the same time. And that's why I like this term, troubling canon, so much. Because it subverts existing power relations. And to get back to the question, do we really need a canon? Because in this whole decanonization discussion, sometimes it's being raised from, well, let's get rid of that canon. My answer is really a bluntly yes, we do need it. And as I said before, not as a fixed entity, but I think it's very important that there will always be names and domains and theoretical viewpoints that should be included. And the most important argument for me is that a canon can be regarded as a body that grows throughout time. And canonizing helps us to systematically turn information into knowledge. And knowledge grows and deepens only when there are certain frames of references that are shared. So with all the possibilities and information internet provides us, especially in this era of self-canonization, my plea would be to strengthen the canon. And to end with the last picture, actually it's a video. I think we have tea now, is that correct? But maybe we could play this film. I think it's a wonderful film. It was commissioned by the Moderne Museum in Stockholm. And in it, a future vision of the new museum is being put forward. And it's a very radical vision, I must say. And it's radical because they say museums have outlived itself, and they have become institutions that are only peer-to-peer communities, organizations. But maybe we could, during tea, I don't know whether that's an idea, to play it. And I would like to thank you for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello? Hello, hello. This one maybe? Mag de mic aan? Hello? Yes, thank you, Mirjam, for your plea. Are there any questions from the crowd? Mitchell, ga jij? And please mention your name.
Hello, my name is Delphine Bedel. So as intersectional and feminist artist and scholar, I'm a strong advocate of data collection. And when it comes to Black feminism or art and feminism in the Netherlands, the data is missing. And I would be interested to hear from the Black Archive if they have data on art and people of color in the Netherlands. Recently, this month, for the first time, new data appeared in Maastricht. There is a survey about auctions and women artists, and Mama Cash did a survey about women exhibited in the Netherlands, and the number are dramatic. It's 13% in 2018. If we look at museum collection, the percentage of women in the collection is between 4 to 10%. The permanent collection on the wall, the numbers drop, is between 2 to 7%. So this is the situation we're dealing with. So some countries and some museums have taken very strong action to try to change that. The Tate, the MoMA, or the French government is putting in place a roadmap, equality, to create financial incentives. Institutions that will not engage with question of inclusivity will be sanctioned financially. Is the Netherlands ready, according to you? Can we start to envision a charter for equality for institutions here? You mentioned policies from the 80s, but we're in 2019. How can we make this change more effective?
Well, actually, the Museum Arnhem is one of the institutions that makes these policies effective since the 80s. Our collection from the 80s is more than 60-70% of women artists. When it comes to other institutions, I think, it's kind of problematic. It's actually really problematic. And last Tuesday, I was at the Stedelijk. Of course, one should make a difference between exhibitions and collection policies. I think it's very important that work of art is being collected as well, because then it becomes part of a story and it can be reshown. Exhibitions are just temporarily. But last Tuesday, I felt very happy walking through the Stedelijk, where there were three exhibitions of women artists, and I had not experienced that before at the Stedelijk. So. To get back to your questions, I think the Dutch museum world, especially since it took more than 10 years to accept this code of cultural diversity, which I think is unbelievable. It makes me sometimes very pessimistic, but you see, being pessimist doesn't give you a lot of energy, so I try to stick to positivism, to optimism. No. Yes, I totally agree. I can share a personal story with you. I prepared a lecture. I was invited to prepare a lecture when the Boijmans van Beuningen reopened. They're going to close again this year, but 10 years ago they reopened after their renovation. And I was one of the persons who was invited to give a lecture. And I thought, well, let's not be very picky and nasty, and let's just be very positive and look at this collection. And I thought, well, let's pick the women artists from that collection that will be hanging in the new presentation of their collection. And then I asked the museum, so who is hanging? And I said, well, where are the women? And they said, well, there's actually no work of a women artist hanging. I said, this is impossible. So then I thought, well, I wanted to congratulate them with their reopening. I thought, let's try to be positive and let's dig into the collection. And in the depots, they could not come up with a list of female artists because they made no difference between female and male, etc., etc. But then I knew some curators. I phoned them and I said, well, you have been buying this and this and this and this and this, so please send me a list. So that's why I started. And so that was then my lecture, because I wanted to dig into the history of some of these works and just stay positive. And then 2 days before my talk, they phoned me and they said, yes, we have Jacoba van Heemskerk is going to be on so. And you should know it's like 1,000 artworks were there on show. So it's a slow business, but I think it's going to change. They cannot afford it to not change, I think.
I think there's room for 3 more questions, and after
Two
the next,
more.
okay, 2. And after that, after the next speaker, there will be some more room for debate and dialogue. So, I see more hands going up.
Hello. Sorry. Hi. Thank you for your talk. Please don't take a picture. It makes me very uncomfortable.
What is your name?
My name is Mariana, and I wanted to address this, your acknowledgement of a need for a canon. Perhaps just with a remark. Perhaps just with a remark, because I think it's kind of important to acknowledge that singularity is rather obsolete by now. And instead of trying, obviously it's important to dismantle the canon, but instead of building a new canon, we can talk plurally, and we can talk about multiple canons, so that there is a more faithful acknowledgement of different locations of knowledge, so different geopolitical locations of knowledge. And then, you know, my canon is going to be different than your canon. So
For sure.
maybe it's important to keep things plural.
Yes.
Yeah?
Yes, that's why I mentioned that the S was lacking and missing. I think it's very important to acknowledge parallel canons. On the other hand, I think it's very important that there are canons that bundle knowledge, that somehow people can take notice of. So there is a shared form of knowledge which can be enlarged and added to. And parallel canons can also have the effect that the way canons are being constructed is not very critical. By just adding names is not questioning actually the hierarchies in canon or in canonizing. For example, works of crochet or knitting works were for a long time very, very much taboo in the art world. And through certain feminist movements in the art world, this has been looked upon now in a very different attitude. So adding to the canon must be, in my opinion, at the same time to take on a very critical standpoint towards the canon and the hierarchies in the canon and who is forming these canons.
Mirjam, thank you very much for your excellent talk. I'm really happy with
Your name is?
I was the one who added the 5th P to the 4 Ps of the Code of Conduct, and I will explain to you why I added the 5th P. I added this 5th P because these institutions never question the power structures within themselves. We hardly have curators of colors. So as long as institutions themselves do not ask themselves, how did we get there? Why are the power structures within our institutions the way they are? We can canonize and we can change the things as much as we want, but we also need to be really critical to the structures within the institutions. And I often feel that this question is skipped. And often the discussion goes about the solution, and often these solutions are cosmetic solutions. What kind of sacrifices are institutions willing to make it more inclusive? Because you need to sacrifice something in order to change.
Yes, I totally agree. And how should I say? One sees it in biennials, for example. The Dutch biennials, like the Sansbeek exhibition, was being curated by a curatorial team from Indonesia. The same team, Ruan Grupa, actually just got appointed as the curatorial team for the next Documenta. And the next Sunspeak exhibition is being curated by Bonaventure Song. And I think this is a change, but those are biennials. That's something different from institutions, established institutions. And I think it's very important that people of color are being appointed as directors, as curators, and not only as personnel for cleaning the toilets. I totally agree.
Thank you so much, Mirjam.